Good morning. This is Chair French convening the regular business meeting of the Kansas Corporation Commission for November 20th, and joined by my colleagues, Commissioner Keene and Commissioner Keither. On today's agenda, we have a consent agenda consisting of 6 items. We have no noticed items, but we do have 3 discussion items noticed for us to address. So we will go ahead and get started with our consent agenda. Commissioners, you've had the opportunity to review those 6 items on the consent agenda. Let me ask at this time if you have any questions, beginning with Commissioner Keither.
No question, thanks.
And Commissioner Keene?
No, for me, I do. Thank you. I would move approval of the consent agenda.
Second.
All right, we've got a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda. Is there any further discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed, say no. The consent agenda is approved. With that, we will move on to the 3 discussion items that I mentioned. We will start first with a couple of items in FERC dockets, and our presenter for those items is Carly Massentine. We will start first on a potential FERC motion to intervene and file comments in ER 26-407. Go ahead, Carly.
Thank you and good morning. On October 31st, 2025, Southwest Power Pool, or SPP, submitted an application with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, for approval of revisions to its open access transmission tariff. These proposed revisions would decouple what are known as Schedule 9 and Schedule 11 pricing zones in the SPP region to allow for the creation of larger Schedule 11 transmission pricing zones. Specifically, Schedule 11 of the Open Access Transmission Tariff charges customers to recover the cost of transmission facilities that were directed to be recovered by SPP, whereas Schedule 9 of the tariff charges customers to recover the cost of those transmission facilities that were built under the initiative of SPP's members. So SPP's current Schedule 9 and Schedule 11 transmission pricing zones are primarily based upon the footprint of legacy transmission systems that those individual transmission owners placed under SPP's functional control over time as they joined the RTO. And as a result, those current zones vary widely in terms of their geographic size and configuration, amongst other factors. So back in March of 2018, the SPP board and its members committee created what was known as the Holistic Integrative Tariff Team, or HIT, to comprehensively review SPP's tariff policies and to make high-level recommendations to ensure the continued, reliable, and cost-effective delivery of electricity to end-use customers. And one of the recommendations from the HIT team was for SPP to decouple Schedule 11 and Schedule 9 transmission pricing zones. The term decouple here relates to how Schedule 11 and Schedule 9 rate recovery will no longer be jointly based on the legacy transmission pricing zones as a basis for their recovery. This proposal will implement new, larger subregions for rate recovery under Schedule 11 of the cost of new byway upgrades that are directed for construction by SPP. And the rate recovery under Schedule 9 will continue to be based on those legacy transmission pricing zones. SPP has declared the decoupling of Schedule 9 and Schedule 11 pricing zones to be more reflective of today's planning and the use of the transmission assets built pursuant to SPP's transmission planning processes. To this date, KCC staff has ardently supported this proposal at SPP to create more equity and cost allocation across the state. Commission staff believes that it would benefit Kansas to intervene in this proceeding and file comments as well. Intervention and comments are due tomorrow, November 21st. Due to the press of other business, our comments have not yet been able to make it through the internal review process, but staff believes it would be beneficial to Kansas to motion for intervention timely tomorrow, and then provide comments in support of the tariff revisions out of time as soon as the same can be reviewed by the Commission. Submitting a motion for timely intervention and to file comments out of time will ensure that this Commission remains informed of the docket's developments and will further preserve the Commission's ability to protect the interests of Kansas ratepayers. I recommend that this Commission authorize our DC Council to file a motion tomorrow for timely intervention and for further authorization to file comments in support of these tariff revisions as soon as those comments have made their way through the Commission's approval process.
All right, thank you, Carly, for that explanation. I think I'll pause here to see if any commissioners have questions of Carly on this item. I may have a few comments briefly, but let me just see if anyone's got any questions or comments they'd like to raise at this time.
No.
Commissioner
Yes,
Keith?
thank you, Chair French. First of all, Carly, thank you for that overview. It was good. It provided background information and provided laid a foundation for why it is we should consider doing this, and I'm going to support this fully. I'm really concerned. I want more feedback from the staff. I want to be better informed about the implications and consequences that are associated with this particular matter. And given the concern I think that we all share, and I personally share it very deeply, about cost allocation issues going forward. For me, the significance of the consequences, intended and otherwise, are such that I think that we need to intervene and we need to be a part of this process and involved in it. I would only add one other comment, and I do so respectfully. I know that the press of business weighs heavily upon us in terms of time. I know that same applies also to Jason Gray. So to the extent he's helping us here, I'm hoping that he can provide us with something that we can in a way that, and I think given the extension of time that we're asking for, it's possible that we can reflect a bit upon his drafts and comment back on those. So anyway, I'm sorry for the excessive explanation here on my part, but this is a significant matter, and I'm glad that we're intervening. Thank you.
Well, with that, I'll go ahead and kick us off and make the motion, and then I'll reserve my comment for after. So at this time, I will move the commission authorize our DC Council to file a motion for timely intervention in FERC docket number ER 26-407 to take such action therein as necessary to protect the interests of Kansas ratepayers, including to file comments in support of the tariff provisions requested by SPP as soon as the comments have made their way through the commission's review process.
Second.
I've got a couple seconds. I think I'm going to take Commissioner Keene in a second. And with that, I'll just tack on just some additional supporting comments. I have to chuckle, at your mention, Carly, that all this started back in 2018. I think Commissioner Keene, you may have been on the commission at that point. I know I wasn't. But it was a long time ago, and it shows how long some of these discussions on difficult issues can take. And Carly said it right. We were strong supporters of this through the SPP stakeholder process. Really pushed to make it happen. Cutting through a lot of the jargon. What this is really about is making sure that costs are allocated more correctly with how the system is actually used and who benefits from those investments. And particularly the issue we saw here was a lot of cost falling on smaller pricing zones in Western Kansas when those lines were really facilitating flows to flow into Eastern Kansas and Missouri and benefit a much larger range of ratepayers. And these tariff changes will facilitate that better cost allocation to the full beneficiaries of those investments. So very supportive of this. So with that, we do have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor? Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was pleased to see that the SPP could find it within their power to come up with yet another acronym.
Oh, that will not stop, I'm sure.
Yeah.
With that, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed, say no. The motion is approved. Now, Carly, we will let you get on to your second presentation. This is again a potential motion to intervene in and file comments in FERC docket number RM 26-4. Go ahead, Carly.
Thank you. On October 27th, 2025, FERC issued an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, otherwise known as an ANOPR, in which, upon request from the Secretary of the Department of Energy, it invited all interested stakeholders to provide comments on potential reforms to ensure the timely and orderly interconnection of large loads to the interstate transmission system. Commission staff believes that it would benefit Kansas to intervene and file comments in this docket. Intervention and comments were initially due on November 14th, 2025. However, FERC has extended that deadline to tomorrow, November 21st. Again, due to the press of other business, comments have unfortunately not been able to make it through the internal review process for approval. Yet staff believes that it will be beneficial to Kansas to motion for timely intervention tomorrow, and then request leave to submit comments out of time as soon as the same can be reviewed by the Commission. Submitting a motion for timely intervention and then to file comments out of time will continue to ensure that this Commission remains informed of the docket's development and preserves the Commission's ability to protect the interests of Kansas ratepayers. I recommend the Commission authorize our DC Council to file a motion tomorrow for timely intervention and for further authorization to file comments as soon as those comments have made their way through the Commission's review process.
Thank you, Carly. Are there any questions for Carly on this item? Beginning with Commissioner Keither,
No questions.
Commissioner Keen.
No questions.
At this time, I will move the Commission authorize our DC Council to file a motion for timely intervention in docket number RM 26-4 and to take such action therein as necessary to protect the interests of Kansas ratepayers, including to file comments as soon as the comments have made their way through the Commission's review process. Do I have a second?
Second.
Everybody's gun shy now. Well, let Commissioner Keither's got this one. All right, we've got a motion and a second to approve this intervention and comments and to file comments. Any further discussion on that motion? I will add a bit of discussion. I believe all the commissioners have seen the letter from DOE Secretary Wright urging FERC to take quick and perhaps bold action to get new large loads interconnected to the system. Those large loads would include things like data centers to win the AI race, which they believe is critical. This is a very timely issue, particularly in the transmission planning space. We're considering very large investments in the grid for these large loads to interconnect and to facilitate them being on the grid reliably. I will tell you, up until the moment today's open meeting started, I was watching FERC's open meeting this morning, where they welcomed a couple of new members, a couple of new nominees from the current administration. They have a full suite of 5 commissioners now, and pretty much all of them had very strong comments that they might not do exactly what the DOE secretary is suggesting, but they are all committed to this goal of building out a lot of infrastructure to connect these large loads and to do it very fast. And I heard multiple people say they were going to take bold action. While those might be laudable goals, I do think it's really important that the Commission intervene in this docket, make our voice heard, make sure that Kansas consumers are protected, and on the other side, to make sure that to the extent infrastructure is built out, it's built out in a way that's beneficial to our state as well as others. So this is a really important proceeding, one that we need to make sure our voice is heard on. So just all that to say, I very much support the motion that I made. So any further comments on this item?
Yes, Chair French, I would add a me too to what you just said, and probably an exclamation point in the form of this. I'm going to admit to being somewhat intimidated by the speed with which some of these enormous projects that have tremendous cost implications are projected to work their way through the system and be approved. We don't need to go to Walden's Pond and indefinitely reflect upon what is before us, but I think we need to have an ample time to reflect so that we can consider again the cost allocation that's going to go with this, and there's an alignment of benefits with those costs, because I'm surmising that these costs are going to be significant, maybe exponentially more so than we're anticipating right now, given the way things kind of turn out as they evolve. So I too, I share some skepticism. I'm going to tell you, I do. I think we just need to be careful about the scale and scope of what we're doing and the implications it has for our ratepayers here. And for those reasons, I join with Commissioner French in welcoming this opportunity to comment before FERC.
All right, thank you. With that, we do have a motion and a second on the floor. If there's no further discussion, all in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed, say no. The motion is approved. Thank you, Carly.
Thank you.
We will now move to our last discussion item, and I suspect this one's going to take just a bit longer than the other two. This is our quarterly update on Southwest Power Pool activities, and our presenter, as has been for the last few quarters, is Mr. Justin Grady. Good morning, Justin.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Good morning, commissioners. I spent the last 10 minutes or so getting this slideshow up and rolling, and my first goal this morning was to make sure that went more smoothly from a technological implementation standpoint. So was I successful? Can you see it?
It looks wonderful.
All right, great. Sounds good. Well, hey, again, good morning, everybody. There's a lot to talk about, so I'm just going to jump right into it here. In terms of an agenda, just, real high level update on a FERC update, 2 filings that were made recently by SPP to FERC, and then we'll talk about the recent Regional State Committee business meeting and what the action items and approvals were that came out of that. And then we'll talk about the recent Southwest Power Pool Board of Directors and Members Committee meeting, which was the next day in Little Rock, both, again, recently, a couple weeks ago. So this is our FERC update. Carly referenced and discussed this HIT C1 initiative. I know there was some discussion about it. This is an issue we've talked a lot about in the past, right? The policy, this is sort of the issue that I somewhat cut my teeth on in direct involvement within SPP, because everyone will recall when Sherry retired last May is when I sort of took over in a direct fashion pertaining to our involvement with SPP. This first came up for a vote, well, for the second time, before COG in Minnesota in June of 2024. Unfortunately, it failed 5-7 in Minnesota at that meeting. And then, there was a pretty extensive outreach effort that occurred, by everybody, all of the states that were in support of this. There were some revisions that were made, and ultimately this did pass. The policy passed the cost allocation working group in September of 2024 in Denver. It then was passed by the Regional State Committee in October of 24. The tariff was approved this last May, and the tariff language, and then ultimately it's been filed before FERC now. So a long time coming, but it definitely was an improvement in cost allocation. And an important distinction here is that this only addresses byway facilities, right? So this is only facilities between 100 kV and 300 kV. And instead of 2/3 of those projects being cost allocated to the local zone, they're now going to be cost allocated to the subregion. So this essentially is a more permanent fix for the Sunflower issue. If you recall that was a HIT C2 issue. If you recall the waiver and the issue in which that was essentially a reallocation of costs from Western Kansas to the rest of the region. This is an attempt to sort of permanently fix that one-off issue that took several years in and of itself to fix, right? So anyway, that's probably enough discussion about HIT C1. We're certainly hopeful that this gets approved at FERC and doesn't go through a 4-year multiple jurisdiction appeal process like the HIT C2 issue did, and I think is still undergoing. So the second issue on the FERC update is the consolidated planning process. We've also talked a lot about that. I think that each of the last, maybe 2 or 3 of the last quarterly updates, we've had a lot of discussion about that. This was filed on November 3rd, 2025 before FERC. And I think we're pretty hopeful about this as well. It literally was unanimously supported at every single phase of the SPP stakeholder process. I know Chair French was heavily involved in this, and this too was a multi-year effort. So, all right, here is the agenda that's before us on relative to the Regional State Committee meeting. I'm not going to hit on any one of these individual bullet points right now because each one of them have slides that we'll talk about. And I am going to go through these pretty quickly because the meat on our agenda today is substantive. I want to leave plenty of time for, substantive conversation and questions and answers. So if I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but as always, feel free to interrupt me at any time here. So there is a new slate of officers for 2026. Nothing on this slide is really a surprise. The current president of the Regional State Committee, the New Mexico commissioner, is leaving his post. The way it works, there's a rotation through these. Chuck Hutchinson, Commissioner Chuck Hutchinson from Nebraska, will be the president next year. And the one addition to this that you haven't seen in the last couple of years is Kayla Hahn. She's the chair of the Missouri Public Service Commission. And Kayla is going to take the treasurer position, so she'll be in line to eventually ascend to the president in 4 years. But again, that was unanimously approved. The next 4 issues are all issues that either the policy has already been approved or they basically were not, very controversial. I mean, these issues do take sometimes, a year to 18 months or longer to move through the process. But ultimately, the Regional State Committee and then the Board of Directors approved 4 different revision requests. We'll just hit on each of these sort of in a summary fashion. The netting of flows of long-term congestion rights. What this refers to, first of all, long-term congestion rights. Well, what are those? Those are a situation where when a load-serving entity and essentially its customers are paying for transmission, it's not just a cost. It's not just an increase in the bill. What customers also get is a hedge against wholesale market exposure. And that's a situation where, if you have firm transmission rights on a transmission line that runs from Jeffrey Energy Center to Topeka, and for some reason the market price in Topeka is higher than what you're being paid for those generators in north, 45 miles northwest of Topeka, then, congestion rights, both transmission congestion rights, annual transmission revenue rights, and long-term congestion rights act to insulate retail ratepayers from that market exposure, that wholesale market exposure. And this is a situation where there were a lot of stakeholders throughout the region that were complaining, were upset about their allocation of long-term congestion rights. This mostly was not a Kansas customer ratepayer issue. But the long and short of it is that these long-term congestion rights have been allocated in a pretty conservative fashion, because once you get a long-term congestion right, it never expires. You can keep it forever as long as you have those firm transmission rights. Well, basically what SPP staff and other stakeholders found is that it's not always that power is only flowing from Jeffrey Energy Center to Topeka. And that's kind of a weird example because there's not a lot of power probably flowing from Topeka to, you know, west, but there are instances in which that happens. And what everybody determined is that, look, if we recognize the netting of flows that occurs on these lines, we can actually give more long-term congestion rights to different entities. And this took a long time. It wasn't necessarily unanimously supported, but at the end of the day, the key points you can see there on the right-hand slide, you know, at the end of the day, there was a solution that was identified that would allow more market participants in the Southwest Power Pool to have these long-term congestion rights. The key is you have to keep them for 5 years once you're granted them. And then also, and very importantly, load serving entities like Evergy and Sunflower and others, if you currently have a long-term congestion right, you get to keep that. There isn't anything about this policy that's going to negatively impact anybody that currently has long-term congestion rights. This is about squeezing out as much capacity on the transmission system as possible relative to that hedge on wholesale market prices. That was definitely more than I wanted to say about long-term congestion rights, netting flows. I got to speed up. So here you can see the stakeholder consensus. I mean, it was pretty high. COG approved it at a 91% consensus rate. So anyway, this will be filed first quarter of 2026. This next RR pertains to generation interconnection, network resource interconnection service. So there's 2 ways that you can get permission to connect to the transmission system if you're a generator in SPP. You can request that your resource be studied as an energy resource or ERIS, or you can request that it be studied as a network resource or NRIS. The reality is that, you know, again, starting back with that HIT task force in 2018, stakeholders and SPP realized that what's happening is everybody is requesting the easiest form of access to the transmission system they can in order to minimize the upgrade costs that they're allocated when these generators attach to the transmission system. Just a quick reminder that if you're a generator and you want to interconnect with the transmission system in SPP, and you're going to break the system, you're going to cause network upgrades associated with, or you're going to cause upgrades associated with the point of interconnection, then you have to pay for those upgrades. And so what became understood, though, was that when load serving entities want to interconnect with the transmission system, they first go through the ERIS process, ERIS, and then they go through the aggregate study process, which is another 180 days to get firm transmission service for those generators to be able to serve their load. And that is the process at which, once they get the ability to use those generators to serve their load, then they get to base plan fund, basically either regionally or zonally allocate those transmission costs to customers. And so that, you know, that's just an extra 180-day, more timely, more costly process. And I think what everybody realized is, look, why don't we, first of all, this issue has been fixed with the consolidated planning process going forward, but that doesn't start until 2027. So what everybody realized is, well, look, if these resources are designated for load, and we clearly have a resource adequacy issue and we need to add generation in this region, then let's allow these generators to designate them as network resource interconnection service, as long as it's being designated to load, and they can skip the aggregate study process and move, you know, right into receive base plan funding. They get a network interconnection agreement faster. They go through the transmission study process faster, and it aligns that cost allocation with what we've sort of fixed in the consolidated planning process. So this will only apply to the expedited resource adequacy study, the ERIS process, which, if you recall, is a essentially that's a reform that SPP made in 2024 to allow load serving entities to bring generators online faster, to basically get ahead of the line if they can prove that they need that generation to serve their own load. And so basically for ERIS and the DICES, which is the regular generation interconnection process for 2024, for those two study processes, this is going to allow entities, load serving entities, to get their generation online faster and to basically have an equitable cost treatment for any kind of upgrades that are necessary to bring those units online. This was not an entirely popular decision. I think ultimately, if I'm being honest, that this probably occurs because some transmission owners and load serving entities knew that they, were going to take advantage of this process in the next 2 years, and other load serving entities were not able to, didn't have a generator that was going to go into this process. I mean, I hate to put it that starkly, but I honestly think that's ultimately what influenced a lot of these lower consensus vote totals. Just as, a matter of information background, this Evergy's new combined cycle gen facilities that the commission just approved will be able to take advantage of this policy change, right? They will be able to utilize this policy change to get an interconnection agreement faster and to cost allocate their transmission upgrades to load, because ultimately those plants are being built to serve load. And so it's just an example of this policy did make a lot of sense, and we were supportive of this, and we were appreciative to see that ultimately the board did approve it. Next steps are it'll be filed at FERC this quarter. These two slides are really self-explanatory. Outage criteria, these are basically refinements and just clarifications that were necessary. Both of these next two issues, both adding the outage criteria to the tariff, you can see there's no controversy there, and also the conventional resource accreditation revisions, performance-based accreditation. Quick recap on performance-based accreditation, what it is, this is one of the key policy revisions that came out of essentially the reliability issues that we've faced in this region and in this state over the last 3 or 4 years. Winter Storm Uri, Elliott, Heather, Jerry, Enzo, all, every one of those winter storms. This is performance-based accreditation essentially says, okay, for thermal generating units, we're going to evaluate and measure your accreditation based on how you are able to respond when the region needs you and calls on you. We're going to evaluate your accreditation based on how well you're able to respond over a 7-year rolling average. Essentially, this is just some clarifications in terms of how that's actually going to be implemented when it goes into effect next year. It also identifies that, look, for brand new constructed thermal resources, you get essentially a 0% EFOF, which is equivalent forced outage factor. This is a recognition that if you have on-site fuel storage, it's a good thing for reliability. If you're building a brand new thermal unit, then you're much less likely to have an outage during an extreme weather event. And the reason, as another reminder, equivalent forced outage factor, this is the fuel assurance aspect of reliability. This is only the top net 3% net load hours during the season. And we talked a lot about this in the predetermination proceeding. The reason why it's reasonable to assume that a brand new combined cycle generating facility is going to be more reliable the next Winter Storm Uri that hits is because it's 60% more efficient on a unit of natural gas consumption to produce electricity than the next least efficient unit, or the next efficient unit. So I think, that's the rationale that is reflected in this policy change, and this was very well supported. You could see 100% support in most of the working groups.
And Justin, if you can just go back to that last slide, just real quick, the one notable thing to me, I'd heard feedback loud and clear from our municipal utilities that they didn't think that the PBA, performance-based accreditation that we initially approved, incentivized or properly recognized the value of their plants, particularly those with on-site fuel storage. And so you can see here that was, as you mentioned, that was one of the major components of this, was to recognize that added value of on-site fuel storage. So that hopefully that was a cleanup that that will be beneficial to them.
Yep, great. Okay. So now we're talking about cost allocation. So a quick refresher with regard to FERC Order 1920, 1920A, and 1920B. There were a lot of I don't know, policy pronouncements and changes in those FERC orders, but to be honest, those FERC orders did not affect the Southwest Power Pool region very much, right? As an example, essentially what those FERC orders did, and they specifically referred to the Southwest Power Pool Regional State Committee process when they did that, is they said cost allocation ought to be the purview and the authority of the states. And so essentially FERC Order 1920 gave other states and other regions the authority that the Regional State Committee already had. But one of the requirements in that order is that you have to select a ex ante, meaning beforehand, before the projects are built. You have to select an ex ante cost allocation method for 20-year notice to construct, 20-year transmission planning items. So the RSC had to make a filing at FERC. I mean, SPP on behalf of the Regional State Committee has to make a compliance filing at FERC to select an ex ante cost allocation method for 20-year projects, because prior to FERC Order 1920, there was the ability to study the transmission system for 20 years, but not to issue notices to construct. And so it's sort of a peculiarity, but we didn't definitively have a cost allocation method within the Regional State Committee of the Southwest Power Pool for 20-year projects. In order to rectify that and come up with something, the Cost Allocation Working Group formed a subgroup called the FERC Order 1920 subgroup. They met over the summer. It was chaired by the COG representative in Nebraska, John Kraksky. They met over the summer. They met every week or 2 weeks. And ultimately, what they came up with, you can see in this call out slide here, what they came up with was a cost allocation for 20-year projects coming out of long-term transmission planning process. And it had 100% consensus within the subgroup, but it only got 60% consensus within the COG. I personally abstained on this vote. I was on the edge of voting no, but I abstained essentially because I realized that the task that this group had been given in such a short period of time sort of set them up for failure from the beginning. And the chair French can address, his votes on this issue as well. I know he was going to vote no for the allocations that came out of this subgroup. But essentially, our biggest concern was these were negotiated allocators, and they did not have any actual engineering or modeling support, substantive evaluation and analysis, and analytical support. And so that's ultimately what our concerns were. And And those concerns were pretty broadly held, honestly, within the regional state committee. And so ultimately what was approved was a motion to keep highway byway, to basically keep the current cost allocation method for 20-year transmission projects coming out of FERC Order 1920, and then move immediately into a comprehensive cost allocation evaluation in the year 2026, which we'll talk about more later. But there's something I want to point out here that was definitely obvious from the results of this subgroup, right? So the allocations that the subgroup came up with were, in my opinion, sort of a proxy vote for people's current discontent maybe with highway byway, right? And so what you see is, in every instance for projects greater than 100 kV, which are, anything below 100 kV is already entirely borne by the zone. But in every instance of transmission projects greater than 100 kV, the will of that subgroup was to get further away from regional cost allocation. It was to more, it was biased towards, or it was oriented towards, more localized cost allocation. And the other thing is, I think that is a recognition of the general degree of discontent with the cost allocation associated with the $3 billion 765 kV transmission line down in New Mexico and Texas, the Potter line that we've talked about. And I think there's a general recognition that the benefits associated with that transmission were not likely shared in a region-wide fashion. And so I think people, we're trying to find a solution to that, and we're trying to push back against regional cost allocation associated with that line. And so ultimately, I think the results here of this subgroup recommendation sort of reflect a level of discontent associated with highway byway and a level of discontent associated with very large reliability focused 765 kV lines in only one area of the footprint. Now that's all, sort of my editorial comments and my evaluation of the situation. But ultimately what you see happened is, so right here, these are the byway facilities we talked about earlier. Today, these are 66% sub-regional. With the HIP C1 proposal we talked about earlier, these will be 66% sub-regional and 33% regional. And you can see the subgroup move that to even less regional recovery, more localized recovery. And then for anything greater than 300 kV, the subgroup moved cost allocation to 50% sub-regional, 50% regional. Now that is a major change in cost allocation policy in the Southwest Power Pool, right? So that's a situation where what has been viewed as a interstate highway system, essentially for the last 20 years through the Southwest Power Pool, they're saying, no, we're no longer going to regionally allocate that. It's going to be 50% allocated to the region. So quick reminder, the subregions that were just filed at FERC, it's essentially Kansas and Missouri are in the same region now. So this would say that any 345 kV line that's going through Kansas or Missouri, 50% of the cost of that would be cost allocated across both states, and then the other 50% would go to the other 12 states in the region. And then lastly, there was a 10% allocation for 700 kV and above projects that would go just to the deliverability zone, which in this case, Kansas and Missouri, that is a deliverability zone. It's complicated, but some subregions were sort of subsets of a deliverability zone, but not in Kansas and Oklahoma and Missouri. So, I mean, that was a lot of conversation about something that ultimately didn't get approved, but I thought that was relevant to discuss, and it does sort of reflect the nature of cost allocation decisions and discussions right now throughout in the region. Ultimately, what got approved with regard to this, the ex ante cost allocation that will be filed at FERC for 20-year projects is highway byway. And then everybody in the room understands that in 2026, there's going to be a comprehensive evaluation of cost allocation with regard to 10-year projects, 20-year projects, et cetera. And the last thing I'll say, because I can tell Chair French came off mute, is another major concern that was recognized by the reason that these cost allocation percentages didn't move forward is I think everybody unanimously understood, or I don't know about unanimously, but a majority of people universally, there was a lot of understanding that it really doesn't make sense to have a completely different cost allocation regime, rule set for 10-year projects versus 20-year projects. So I think that was another major factor that drove this decision of, let's not do this in a piecemeal fashion. Let's just move forward with expediently to evaluate cost allocation comprehensively in 2026. I'm done on this slide. Go ahead, Chair.
The only thing I was going to add, because you said everything I would have said, Justin, is just, just for context, just remind everybody, don't get too hung up on this, these Order 1920 cost allocation specific votes. I mean, I would say they were definitely a proxy discussion for the bigger cost allocation discussion. I think it's my personal opinion. I don't think SPP is ever going to use the Order 1920 20-year planning process or any cost allocation that comes out of it. I think they're going to build stuff out of their 10-year ITP, and then in the future they'll build stuff out of the consolidated planning process. So just to reiterate what Justin said, I mean, these discussions were much more sort of a proxy discussion of people's dissatisfaction, or maybe not dissatisfaction, just concern about the current state of cost allocation, not necessarily how it's operated in the past. I think people are generally satisfied with how it's operated in the past. I think, I would emphasize what Justin said. I mean, there was definitely one line that got everybody paying attention. It was a almost $4 billion line in a very discrete part of the footprint. And that's really what's changed, and why people are so sure that we need to take a new look at cost allocation. Is it used to be you'd have an annual portfolio. I mean, they could be big. I mean, they could be hundreds of millions of dollars, but it wasn't so big that you couldn't just wait around and wait a few years and see how things evened out over multiple portfolios to make sure that, everybody was getting theirs. Now the dollars are so big and being proposed, maybe not entirely region wide. Projects are being discussed in just very discrete parts of the footprint. And because the dollars are so big, people are maybe saying, I can't just wait to make sure I'm going to benefit on the next go round. This is going to have a huge impact on customers. And I just can't wait to see if things even out. So I think that's just the general gist of, why I include myself and Justin, why we are concerned and wanting to take a look at this. So I think I just reiterated everything you said, Justin, but just want to make sure people don't get too hung up on these specific votes, because my personal opinion is they were votes on things we will never use. It was really just an opportunity for a proxy discussion.
Justin, unless you wanted to respond to that, I had a question I wanted to ask.
No, go ahead, Chair.
This is a very interesting slide, and especially that part of the slide just below where your arrow is right there. That on the issue of deliverability, sub-region cost allocation from zonal all the way to regional across the different sizes of lines. I'm going to go ahead and ask the question I was going to save for later because I think it's more opportune to ask it now, given the fact that we've waded into this subject in some detail. And I'm going to ask this question. I mean, I think it could draw some inferences from what you said, as well as the fact that you've really addressed some of the issues too. But I'm going to just ask it more specifically so we can kind of, if you can kind of give us kind of an overview of what you anticipate are going to be the key issues that have to be addressed in conjunction with this 2026 comprehensive study of cost allocation.
Well, that's a really good question. So, and there are a few additional slides here that we'll talk about specific policy revisions, policy votes that came up both at the regional state committee as well as at the board pertaining to cost allocation. And you'll see one of these issues, the public policy, it's called public policy cost allocation, and it's essentially a situation where this was approved. So it's essentially it's a form of ex ante cost allocation that says, look, if there are states within the SPP region that have public policy goals that are extensive enough that they are actually driving the construction of transmission. And I think most people are thinking of zero carbon energy type goals here, right? I mean, but admittedly, it is uncertain. But I mean, a major question needs to be, how are we going to implement the public policy ex ante cost allocation that did just pass through the RSC? Another question is going to be, how can we potentially implement the state agreement process that also was approved? I'm sorry, that did not pass the regional state committee. I think there will be another attempt to
Yeah, neither of those were approved, right, Justin?
actually, so I mean, we'll look, but
Okay.
Yeah, so the public policy cost allocation did pass 8-4. Yeah. Unless I put this slide together entirely wrong. I mean, I'll verify if not, but no, I mean,
We'll double check on it.
I took this directly from the minutes. So the other issue, and we'll talk some about it, is the state agreement process, which did not pass. And I think there's definitely an interest in moving that forward as well. But here's the thing, right? The deficiency that everybody pointed out with regard to these specific cost allocation percentages is that they were not supported by analytical modeling. They were not supported by power flows or a detailed, intensive benefit cost analysis, and maybe how benefit cost ratios would change upon different cost allocation ratios. I mean, none of that was presented. And at least for me personally, those are elements that I want to see addressed in 2026 in this care group that we're a part of, right? So, I mean, I'm sort of starting to brainstorm what cost allocation revisions or policy changes could look like in 2026. Myself, the kickoff meeting, the first kickoff meeting for this care group is December 10th in Dallas. But I mean, this is definitely not publication ready, but all of this is sort of on the fly, so I'll throw this out. I mean, I like, for instance, I wrote down myself an idea this morning, and which was, look, is it possible to have an ex ante or an ex post cost allocation that says if more than 66% of the benefits, for instance, these are just raw numbers, right? Or rough numbers. If more than 66% of the benefit of one individual transmission line is being felt by one individual zone, well, then maybe that zone should be responsible for 50% of the costs of that line, 66% of the cost of that line. I mean, you know, the legal standard here that we got, what we have to keep in mind is, even though the RSC has jurisdiction over cost allocation, every idea we come up with will be filed at FERC, and it will be litigated there, and it might be appealed there, but it's got to pass the legal standard of roughly commensurate. What does that mean? Well, that's a good question. That's like, what does just and reasonable mean? All right. What does in the public interest means? But what we have is we have guideposts in which FERC has approved certain cost allocation schemes in the past. And you can look at that, but ultimately we've got to figure out, if highway byway is no longer just and reasonable, then what is going to be just and reasonable? And the legal standard that will be evaluated by is, are the costs and the benefits associated with new transmission projects being allocated in a roughly commensurate fashion? That's the legal standard. So I know that was, pretty high level response, but there's a lot that's going to be ultimately evaluated in 2026 in this care team.
Justin, I want to add on. I agree with everything you said, but I know the question wasn't asked to me, but I want to directly answer it as well. What I expect out of this team. And by the way, I'm not on it, but Justin is, which I'm really, really glad about. I'm ecstatic that we're going to have such good representation on that team. So I really think there's two components here. And I'm probably wrong. There's probably 18 components, but there's probably 200 components. But at that super high level, I agree. You can look at this table here and see these percentages, and it's possible these are the right percentages. I don't know, but I agree with Justin. There's got to be some analytical underpinning. Some analysis done, power flow analysis or something that shows you that we can hang our hat on to say these are the right allocations for different voltage types. The other piece, though, that I think is maybe the bigger thing to me, because I think it's possible that we say actually highway byway is the right method, to the extent costs are allocated region wide. That means that basically you pay based on your load ratio share. So if we're building more transmission to accommodate load growth, it means the area that's experiencing that load growth is going to pay more. So that it's actually we've already got a pretty flexible policy. The bigger problem that I see is that on the wholesale level, at the transmission planning level, they are not able to crack the nut that I think we just cracked on the retail level. And I'd be interested in Justin's commentary here, but we just approved a set of tariffs for large load customers that say, look, if you sign up and you say you want to take service, we need you to commit to a certain amount, a certain service level, what's going to be your demand for the next 12 to 17 years. And you're going to pay for that. You're going to commit to pay for that over 12 to 17 years, whether you use it or not. And so we've come up with a scheme that says when people pop up and say they want to be here, they are committing to providing long-term revenue certainty. We don't have that at the wholesale level, and it is a cost allocation problem because the build outs that are being planned they are not driven as they were in the past based on sort of a changing mix of generation types. Now they are being driven by large load forecasts in particular zones. And I'll just say it right now, if all of that load shows up exactly as projected, I don't think we have an issue. But basically what happens is you've got a whole bunch of new customers that show up. Those zones load ratio shares go up. Other zones that don't have that new load, their load ratio share goes down. They pay less. Everybody's happy. You've got a bunch of new customers that basically come on and pay for all the new infrastructure that they're causing. The problem is we don't because that these plans are made based on growth projections, load growth projections, not based on customer contracts. We don't have a mechanism for all that load growth to basically sign on the dotted line and say, yeah, I'll pay for this transmission over the long term, or I'll go ahead and raise my hand and provide long-term revenue certainty. And so, I mean, the thing I'm looking for out of this team is, what kind of guardrails? Do we need guardrails to either provide us assurance that those customers are going to show up and pay for it? Do we need to say, hey, if your zone's load projections are the ones causing this build out, then your zone needs to commit that your load ratio share is going to be higher for 10 years, for 20 years. The other possibility is we create more off ramps. I think that's already in process, but more off ramps that if it looks like the load growth is for some reason not showing up the way we expected, that there is a way to reverse course and to not make these investments. So those are just a couple quick ideas. I am sure this team is going to come up with more, but the short answer for me is I want to see the region fix things or explore ways to fix things the way that we just did on the retail level. We need to protect customers and zones in the same way on the wholesale level that we've done on the retail level. So that's like super high level, but that's my perspective on it.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, absolutely. So in that's not an entirely theoretical discussion, right? Because in that first kickoff meeting in Dallas, SPP has asked me to provide an overview of what this commission just approved in that large load power service tariff. And they have done that because there is at least some interest in that kind of customer protective, take or pay type of contractual arrangement at the wholesale level. This is just restating what Chair just said, right? But it would be a take or pay type of a contractual arrangement with long-term revenue certainty that says, if we're going to build infrastructure to serve you, then you need to be there to pay for that. And whether you're using it as much as you said you were going to or not, that's essentially that's one of the most important elements of that large load power service tariff, right? And I think there's growing interest in the region to see that kind of a customer protective element as well. The only other minor clarification, we're going to get into the details of the ITP later, but to a certain extent, these large, uncertain spot loads that are out there in the future, that's not necessarily an issue that is driving transmission construction today. And I can demonstrate that to you in the slides that are later. It's the SPP is looking at a 33% increase in load in the region, based on customers that have signed contractual arrangements with their load serving entities today, right? That's what's that 75 gigawatts of load by 2035 is. So but it's just a few years away, right? And every time another 6 months or 12 months passes, more contractual arrangements are signed. But yeah, ultimately, I think that's a big part of it as well, is revenue certainty and accountability for load forecasts associated with that. Yeah, so yeah. Commissioner Keen, did I do your question any justice at all?
You both did. I was writing down some of the things that you were just noting there. The only reason for my delay in responding. No, and I appreciate the Chair French's views on this as well. I think the granularity with which we discussed this morning is very beneficial, and I think the experience that we've been through as an agency, and that you personally, Justin, have been through as the division head and overseer of how we proceeded on the large load issue, is going to really is going to be really beneficial going forward as you consider these issues you've alluded to in 2026. If I overgeneralize just a bit, and let me run the risks that go with overgeneralization, what I kind of understood both of you to be saying here, and if I've distilled this in the wrong way, please correct me, is that basically the larger the low growth share, the greater the probability that the cost allocation will be more zonal than regional. Is that a takeaway?
Yeah.
Have I overgeneralized to an extent that really is non-beneficial?
No, well, it's just a slight nuance. It's just a slight clarification in that load ratio share, the way it works today, right? It's all that is it's a 12 CP. It's a 12 coincident peak backward looking cost allocation. That's what it means. So when, Kansas pays about 16.5% of the Southwest Power Pool regional transmission projects, that means that looking back over the last 12 months, when that means that on average, Kansas is using 16.5% of the transmission system when the transmission system, the region, meets its monthly peak. On average, we're using about 16.5% of that. That's what that is, right? So, and different voltage classes of transmission get cost allocated differently, either more zonally or more regionally, right?
Right.
So yeah, I mean, when you look at some of the forecasts, the oil and gas electrification that's occurring in the Permian and that's occurring in the Bakken, that is driving a lot of this transmission. If they really are going to use 10% more power, Kansas is paying less and less and less for transmission that is being built in the region. They're paying more and more and more. So there's two-sided, right? It's like, well, is the allocation, the calculations themselves, the highway byway, how different voltage classes are cost allocated either zonally or regionally, should that change? And then also, can we actually count on the fact that you will be there to contribute to the 12 CP peaks so that you actually pay your portion of these costs, right? Mm-hmm.
That's very helpful. I appreciate that nuanced answer, which it was helpful. I appreciate both of you weighing in on this thing, and it's going to be an interesting year.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's move forward. A lot of good discussion to come. I just checked my calendar. The next meeting, I only have a meeting at 1:00, so we got some time. I probably should eat prior to that, though. But all right. So this is the one that I say passed and Chair French thinks might have failed. I don't know. We might have to revise this later, but
It probably passed if you check the minutes.
well, I think I did, but all right. So this is the public policy cost allocation. It is somewhat of an ex ante. You can think of it as ex ante because it would basically say we would put into tariff language that if there is a state with a public policy, law, or regulation that is literally driving the construction of transmission, then that state has to agree to pay for those transmission costs, basically. And there's a lot of ambiguity about what public policy actually means. There was a lot of clarification at the meeting that said, look, we've never actually built a transmission project that was driven by an individual state's public policy goals or cost allocate, public policy regulations or laws. So refinement of this concept is definitely going to be part of the work that occurs in 2026 as well. Okay, so the state agreement process is a situation where, and this is another option that received some specific mentions in FERC Order 1920, 1920A, and 1920B. The real question here that is outstanding that remains is whether or not a smaller subset of the region can agree to change the cost allocation for the region and potentially for non-consenting states. That's the question that is outstanding, because there is, to be honest, there are some sort of conflicting paragraphs within that 1,000-page order so it's not entirely clear. But what the state agreement process would be is, so there was two different options. You'll see on the next slide, there was two different options considered. But it's a situation of for any transmission facility greater than 100 million or 150 million, if 2/3 of the states in the region vote to evaluate that, it would be a majority of the states would have to vote to evaluate the project. And then at that point, it would take 2/3 vote to change the cost allocation on a going forward basis. And so, I would say it is not a surprise to anybody that follows this process closely that the whole state agreement process is largely being driven by discontent associated with the cost allocation of a few very large lines in the southern portion of the footprint. I mean, that's the reality of it. I think there are people that think that Potter County 765 kV line was a reliability line in order to serve electrification in the Permian Basin. And the benefit cost ratio was very high for those local zones and those local areas. But on the other hand, it wasn't all that high, maybe 1,000 miles north of there or 2,000 miles north of there. And so it's just a question. I think there is a strong desire to say, if we find a situation that is inequitable, that we have serious concerns about, the states want to have the ability to basically do an ex post cost allocation evaluation and say, we're not going to use ex ante for this. We're going to do a different evaluation, a different analysis. So here's the two motions that both failed. This is another indication of how interesting 2026 is going to be. Look at they were perfectly offset, five votes in favor and 5 opposed. For the first motion, which was, essentially it took a 2/3 majority to reallocate costs to the other states. That failed. So then they did another motion to say, okay, what about a simple majority? Well, that failed as well. But they were both literally 6-6 and 5-5. I continue to think that something like this is going to be ultimately will be approved in 2026. I hope it is, because I do think I think a policy like this has merit. I think it gives a little bit more control to the states in the event that the ex-ante cost allocation didn't work out the way states thought it would. I think I just, I think that it also will introduce some accountability and a little bit more rigor, analytical rigor with regard to the planning of the transmission lines and ensuring that cost benefits, planning of the portfolio and ensuring that cost benefit is more equally distributed throughout the region. But there's a lot of varying opinions about this issue. And a lot of people think that this would be a bad road to go down because it would be inviting litigation and constant battles before FERC every time we build a transmission line. So I don't know, there's a pretty wide diversity of opinion about this issue. But, and the last thing I'll say about it is, if it does get approved, at the end of the day, FERC would still have to approve whatever kind of ex post cost allocation would come out of a state agreement process. So, for the states that worry they would be on the wrong side of this, ultimately it's still whatever gets approved is going to have to be determined, right, to be just and reasonable and roughly commensurate in terms of benefits and costs. All right. So we alluded to this before. This is the slide that I added this morning at 9:50 a.m. By the way, I did not. I forgot to put this into the presentation. So, Commissioner Keen, your prediction was correct. SPP is going to continue to come up with fancy acronyms. We have a new organization, new subgroup or new group that's going to address cost allocation specifically in 2026. It's called the Cost Control and Allocation Review and Evaluation Team, the CARE team. The analytical, I don't know, the framing, the background or the framework essentially for a team like this is modeled after the REAL team. Realizing Energy Assurance Leadership Team, or resource adequacy and energy adequacy, leadership team that Chair French was instrumental in forming a couple years ago. The idea there being that it is a cross-functional leadership team, including members of the SPP board and a lot of different areas of expertise within SPP. And I think the idea is that if something can come out of this group that gets the consensus and maybe even, unanimity, then it is more likely to be accepted by the entire board and to be accepted by all of the membership. It's obviously not going to be an easy charge. We know that there's wide variety of opinions and diverse opinions about cost allocation, and it's not going to be an easy year, but here's the membership of it. It's co-chaired by Chair Hahn of Missouri and independent board member Steve Wright of the board of directors. And you can see the rest of the membership here. We did early on reach out and request membership on this team, and I'm sure a lot of different states did. We were pleasantly surprised to find out in Little Rock in November that we do have a membership seat on this organization. And so, yeah, so that's it. I mean, we'll see what comes out of it. Ultimately, whatever will come out of it will be recommended to the regional state committee, because they do have cost allocation authority, and then ultimately to the board. And then of course it'll have to be approved by FERC. So,
You know, Justin, the one notable thing here, this is the first time I'd actually seen the membership, the full membership. I knew who the RSC members would be, and I knew who the COG members would be, but I hadn't seen the board and SPP membership. I do think the one notable thing I notice here is, unlike some other groups that were formed, you know, the Real Team, for instance, and some others, those groups often reflect sort of a broad range of SPP membership. You know, you've got generation developers, you've got public interest groups that might be represented. It is notable here that, you know, we've got regulators, we've got board of directors, but from the SPP membership, you know, I recognize all these names. These are representatives from load serving entities, and I think that was probably a reflection that SPP wanted to make sure that you had, if we were going to talk about cost allocation and cost controls, it was important to have representatives from companies, you know, whose customers actually pay for the infrastructure, rather than sort of that broader membership group. So I'm not necessarily making any comment. I think the comment speaks for itself, but that was notable to me, to notice that.
okay, let's get into the second half of the conversation. See how quickly this goes. But so, as is usually the case, right? The regional state committee meeting is on the first day of this 2-day event, and then the board votes on the next day. The board meeting is the next day. So on November 4th, the board approved the first 4 revision requests that we've already talked about. So I won't go into any discussion about those. And then the rest of the agenda is here. First thing we'll talk about is the operating budget. This was an interesting update because it's the first time that we've seen the administrative fee for SPP actually decline. And there's a couple of instructive takeaways, you know, associated with this, right? I mean, sometimes I think people might think that, you know, the idea of load growth, additional load growth, reducing rates is some sort of pie in the sky theoretical concept, but it literally is happening with regard to this administrative fee, right? So you can see that the net revenue requirement, so everything that it takes to operate the administrative functions of the Southwest Power Pool across the 14th state region, is increasing by 6% from $204 million to $216.5 million. But the billing determinants that are supporting all of that administrative work is actually increasing more than that. So, you know, it's increasing by 9.3%, just associated with the expansion of the RTO to the west. And so, and there's obviously also, you know, intrinsic load growth that's occurring as well within the system. And so the bottom line is that the effective administrative fee is going down by 4.6% for 2026. So it's, you know, so and this is per megawatt hour. So one way you can think about this is that a standard residential customer using 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per year pays about 47 cents a month, right, in 2025 for all of the administrative functions that the Southwest Power Pool provides. And that's going down to 45 cents a month. So we'll see how this keeps up as the load growth, continues in this region. This was the next somewhat major decision that the board made. This is the Beckham County to Potter project. It's a 150-mile, 345 kV line in western Oklahoma. The original study cost estimate for this line was $430 million. It is associated with that Potter Crossroads Phantom 765 kV line. It's just part of the associated infrastructure there, but it was not determined to be a reliability project that was needed within 3 years, a short-term reliability project. So it went competitive bidding, and here's the results of what happened. So there were 2 bidders. The cost of construction that they are estimating, and ultimately there are cost caps associated with this. It's quite a bit less than the original estimate of $430 million. I know there's a lot of robust opinions about the benefit of competition when it comes to building transmission lines, but it seems like to me that the instances of that being beneficial in terms of overall project costs outweigh the instances where it's not beneficial. But that's my editorial comment. But in any case, you can see this is the scoring category. This is the attachment Y for quarter 1000 process that SPP uses. And you can see both bidders were very, very close in a lot of these categories. But ultimately, the reason that the board selected proposal B was because of the lower revenue requirement and the lower construction costs. And that wasn't without controversy as well. There was a lot of comments about the fact that, look, if you look at engineering design, there were people that made comments, in this meeting that we're not appropriately valuing for the reliability aspects, the differentiations associated with the different conductor types and different, resiliency of the transmission lines. All we're focusing on is the revenue requirement. There's not that much of a difference. In any case, what was approved was proposal B to build this transmission line. That is Transource Oklahoma, which, as a reminder, is owned by 13.5% by Evergy and 86.5% by American Electric Power. Proposal A was NextEra Energy Southwest Transmission, LLC, which is the entity that built the Wolf Creek to Blackberry line in Kansas. You can see it was a unanimous recommendation, and ultimately it was approved by the board. Okay. Now we're into the ITP, 2025 ITP. The first motion that passed the board was not a controversial one. It was simply the question of the board has to approve the integrated transmission planning report. That's part of the tariff requirement that FERC requires. There was 95% support at Markets and Operations Policy Committee that yes, the SPP staff had done their job. They met their NERC requirements. They met their reliability requirements, and they completed the evaluation and they completed the plan. That is an active link. You can click on that in your version and read the ITP report itself. The rest of what we're going to talk about with regard to the ITP is the issuance of notices to construct that came out of that report, or the issuances of notices to construct that were approved by the board and by the different working groups. And also, you know, full disclosure, like most of the slides in this presentation, I stole all of this from SPP staff and their presentation. So these are the actual presentation, the actual slides that were delivered in the meeting earlier this month. So, you know, this is, I believe, the way SPP staff opens up, you know, their board presentations is, you know, their view is, you know, the grid is at its limits. And, you know, I think there was a lot of conversation over the last several months about what's driving this transmission. You know, it's not a green agenda or a changing of the generation mix. There's more thermal generation in these plans than there ever has been. Clearly, every load serving entity in the SPP region is developing additional thermal generation to support reliability. What's driving this transmission is increased electric demand, right? So whether it's the onshoring of or the reshoring of domestic manufacturing or data centers or electric vehicle growth and adoption, the home heating, electrification of home heating, electricity demand is growing in this country. And, you know, you see that, that the recognition of that is universally reflected in whether it be a NERC, you know, a NERC presentation or a NERC report that you see, the winter regional reliability assessment. Electric growth in the winter of 25 and 26 is expected to grow by 20 gigawatts in this country relative to last year, right? 20 gigawatts is a lot. That's 20 Wolf Creek power plants. So there is a lot of additional load growth that's occurring in this country. And that load growth is occurring in the Southwest Power Pool as well. These are just, you know, again, these are all their slides. I'm not going to read this stuff to you, but it's, I'm trying to just present the information the way that it was presented and received in these meetings. What the reality is that the least aggressive, you know, the most conservative estimates of increasing load growth in the region right now is a 25% load growth between now and 2030. That's the most conservative estimate of load growth in the Southwest Power Pool region. And, you know, this was a graphic that was originally used to support the $19 billion portfolio, or $18 billion, depending on whether or not you include zonal planning project costs. This was the graphic that, you know, 2 months ago we thought we were facing. Basically, was that staff was going to be supporting a $19 billion portfolio. It had, you know, 6 to 10 benefit cost ratio over the next 40 years across the region. Quite a bit of asymmetry, though, or, you know, quite a bit of different distribution of benefit cost ratios across the states, which was one of our original concerns about this bigger portfolio. But this is where we started, right? And then this is essentially the progression of what happened with the ITP portfolio over the last couple of months. I know the commissioners, I know you guys have, I've done my best to keep you informed and updated as this process, unfolded, but it is started with an $18.1 billion portfolio. Sometime in late September was I think when this portfolio was finalized, and we first started getting an opportunity to evaluate and understand what we might be facing as a region and as a state. And on October 1st, there was a meeting with the Transmission Working Group and Economic Studies Working Group that unveiled for the first time that SPP staff was recommending an $11.1 billion portfolio. They were, in terms of constructing it, they were recommending about $7 billion of that portfolio be deferred for further evaluation later in 2026. At that time, our major concerns, we were involved in the Economic Studies Working Group, Transmission Working Group meeting. Our major concerns were the disparity of benefit cost ratios through the region and the uncertainty about the benefit cost ratios for the state of Kansas at that time with the $11 billion portfolio. It's worth noting that this only passed by one vote, and we were one vote away from a smaller portfolio of about $7 billion passing Transmission Working Group and Economic Studies Working Group. And when I say we, I mean, everybody that was involved in the process, that was attempting to get more information and understand the reality of the situation with regard to this transmission investment. $7 billion would have been basically the smallest portfolio of projects that SPP staff could likely get FERC to approve. In other words, that was literally the base reliability, NERC reliability required projects. They would not have been able to meet their FERC and NERC tariff obligations with anything less than $7 billion. That message came across loud and clear in these meetings. Kansas traveled to the Markets and Operations Policy Committee meeting in Little Rock after the ESWG TWG meeting. And we advocated for that $7 billion portfolio essentially to be approved. If not the $7 billion, our view was there's enough uncertainty about the benefit cost ratios. There's enough of a concern about affordability that we should be building the least regrets, transmission portfolio, the minimum sort of reliability sized portfolio that we can at this point until we do, at a minimum, a full evaluation of an overview of the entire region for 765 kV lines, as well as getting much more certainty and rock solid cost benefit analysis coming out of SPP. Ultimately, what was approved at the Markets and Operations Policy Committee was an $8.5 billion portfolio. That consisted of that bare minimum $7 billion reliability portfolio, plus another line that was considered economic in 2025, but based on updated load contracts that have been signed, it was going to be a reliability project next year. And so ultimately, that's what was approved at MOPSI, was this $8.5 billion. And so everything we're going to talk about after this slide is mostly going to focus on the $8.5 billion of transmission that was approved by the Markets and Operations Policy Committee. Ultimately, that's what was approved by the board as well. It was far from certain that the board was only going to approve the 8.5 billion. It was 4 hours of intense debate in which about half the people in the room wanted more transmission and wanted to at least go back to the ESWG, TWG portfolio. Probably 25% of the people of that 50% would have preferred the $18 billion portfolio. And about the other half the people in the room were saying, we're at a place where we can say with a straight face that our states are not going to be harmed by this construction. At least everybody has a positive benefit cost ratio. Don't go backwards in terms of what we've made progress, urging the board to approve this 8.5 billion and no more. And ultimately that's what the board approved. So I've spoken for too long without pausing for questions, and I see that Commissioner Keen's off mute. So go ahead and take questions now, and then we'll get into some more detail in the remaining portions of the slides.
Justin, this presentation is really excellent. I think the granularity with which you're approaching these issues it's necessary to educate us and those who are listening in as well. My question here with respect to this slide before you move on to focusing more on the 8.5 billion that was approved is the meaning, your take on the real meaning behind these deferrals. And I think you've addressed that in part, but I want to kind of ask it in maybe a little different way. What do these deferrals to 2026 actually mean in terms of, I know our preference was for a more holistic approach throughout the entire footprint on these 765 kV lines because of the costs associated and all the other implications that ensued. So what is your take on what this deferral means? What effect does that have on the holistic approach we approved? Does it simply mean that we've just literally deferred a piecemeal approach until 2026?
Yeah, there is a little bit more detail later in terms of what deferral means, but it's several things. One, it's deferral to 2026, the year 2026, but also the 2026 ITP.
Right.
So that the 765 kV overlay can be evaluated on a region-wide basis. I think so that and I don't think necessarily that the outcome of that holistic region-wide evaluation is guaranteed. I think there is a lot of skepticism still. There is a lot of question about whether we actually need this voltage class. What are the benefits of it? What are the costs of it? That's what it is. It's essentially what you see. What happened is everything that they could have deferred that was not base reliability driven project costs, they did defer. And said, we'll evaluate it holistically across the entire region. The other thing is the deferral, because a lot of this investment is driven by spot loads. It's not exactly certain exactly where these spot loads are going to occur. So some of it is refinement in terms of, end points and substations. Those might change. That's weird. I'm not doing that. Did you see that?
You really like your comments.
That is
Give
weird.
himself a thumbs up.
I think the AI identified that I was using my hand. That's crazy. Anyway, I did not do that. But so some of it is refinement from an engineering planning perspective. Also, it's deferral to evaluate holistically across the entire region so as to not give a smaller subset of the region an economic development advantage, for instance, right, to attract new customers. And then you'll see there are a few other sort of protections associated with, there's a new process coming out of SPP called Business Practice 760. It's sort of a refined practice. And what it says is, look, it's somewhat similar to what we were talking about before, but maybe not quite far enough. It says, if you have loads you're projecting that are so significant, we're building transmission associated with that. And you got a limited time to show us a binding contractual agreement that you're going to provide electricity for that customer. And if not, we're going to reevaluate these notices to construct. So it's that as well, right? But it's and cost allocation. I mean, a lot of people mention that. Like, I don't want to determine with necessity what we're going to be building until I know and have more confidence in the cost allocation of these projects. So it's a lot.
Okay, that's great. Not to belabor that anymore. Very briefly, if we could go back to the prior slide. Okay, the one before that even, please. And the next one, the one previous to that. Okay, given this acknowledgement about the grid being at its limits and the anticipated direction and scope of growth going forward, I guess the companion question to me that kind of cries out, and I think maybe 2 slides forward from where we are here, maybe addresses that. Yes, addresses it a bit. My question is, okay, where is this increase in load growth concentrated? I think that's an important question. So
yeah, it is.
Can you kind of answer that?
Yeah, it is. And, you know, I don't have a great slide in this presentation that shows you that, but I have one in mind that I mean, I got to find it, but there is one that they present that I mean, there is obviously extensive load growth right here in this part of the service territory where my pointer is pointing, right? And it's not just the load that we are already planning and have already been planning for, but there is extensive economic development growth occurring in the Kansas City metro area and west of there. You know, a lot. So the problem is what we get is also highly competitively sensitive, that SPP gets the stuff and then they anonymize it and provide, you know, big high level maps to the membership. But I mean, there is a slide I will find and I will send you guys. It won't help for the benefit of everybody else listening in, but there is extensive load growth occurring throughout the entire region. Now, I will say that the majority of the load growth that is anticipated in the next several years, a lot of it is big spot loads, right? But there is another slide in this presentation too that will show some of this.
Hey,
but
Justin, I think I've got the slide you're talking about. If you want me to just share it real quick.
oh yeah, might as well try to.
Let me see if I have the ability, and you can tell me if it's the wrong slide. Let's see. Can you see that, Justin?
Not yet. It just says you've started. Oh yeah.
Is that the one you were thinking of?
No.
Dang.
It's all right. That is in my slide deck, but
Okay.
No, you know, the reality is though, let me see if I can get this back up here. Yes. The reality is there is load growth occurring throughout the region, but it's not universally occurring at the same time. And that's another element that they pointed to, that SPP staff pointed to in terms of, so I'm back, right? You guys can see the presentation.
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
Yes, we see it.
So there's another slide that I'll show you here that shows what was actually deferred But you see these two purple and yellow dotted lines. These were anticipated to be 765 kV lines terminating at the Viola substation, right where that combined cycle gen facility is going to go. And there was question about whether that was the best location, right? Because we're spending this much money, it's like, is that the very best substation, or should it be in Western Kansas, or should it be a little bit further to Eastern Kansas? And so these lines were ultimately deferred. This was a double circuiting of that 765 kV Potter line.
Mhm.
This was deferred. And in this middle portion right here was deferred. But I think what we'll see is that as we move forward into the different years of the ITP, what we've heard is that the load growth is distributing throughout the region a little bit more. It's maybe a little bit more concentrated in this oil and gas electrification load. There's a lot of load. There's a load pocket down here in the Shreveport, Louisiana. And it is a good idea to point out. I mean, it's factual to point out, right, that this is not entirely theoretical with regard to what happens when load growth outpaces infrastructure. There were outages. Memorial Day weekend, Shreveport, Louisiana was in the dark. All right. It's happening, right? I mean, Southwest Public Service has had outages in April when during low wind events. So
Hey, Justin, can I just add a little context specific to Commissioner Keen's question of timing? One of our biggest concerns, as we mentioned multiple times, is the fact that they're starting all of this just in the South. That we thought that's kind of a piecemeal approach. We'd feel much more comfortable if we saw what the overall plan was. But to be fair, I mean, the reason they started there is because that is where the load growth was showing up first. In the 2025 ITP, the load projections were heavily focused in Oklahoma, and then down in the Permian Basin, the oil and gas electrification down there actually is much bigger than or is bigger than data center load growth. So I mean that's what showed up in the 2025 ITP. But what they have told us is that as they're starting to get the load projections in for the 2026 ITP, that load growth is starting to show up in sort of the Kansas City metro, Nebraska, and North Dakota. And so it's spreading out more. But that was the reason that we saw this, all of this flurry of stuff planned in the South, is just because that's where the load started to show up first. So it's not entirely their fault. I still don't. My own opinion is it wasn't the right strategic move to just start in that area when you're talking about something this big. You should probably come with something more holistic. But I mean, that's just the way their planning process works. Is they plan for what shows up in the models, and it just happened in 2025 that's where it was showing up first. So that I just wanted to make sure we really clearly answered your question on that, Commissioner Keen.
I think you have. We can move on. I appreciate the input from both of you. It's helpful. Thank you.
You are muted, Justin.
Oh, thanks. Sorry, guys. This is a slide that I duplicated in the slide deck, but I wanted just to provide the context. So everything that's grayed out, right here, see these? This is that line I talked about before. These are those lines going up to Viola. This is another 765 kV over here and a double circuiting of this circuit. That's everything that was deferred to 2026. What ultimately ended up being built was this, or notices to construct, to be built over the next 6 to 10 years, right, is from Woodward to Crawfish Draw to Phantom, sort of looping in that Potter 345 line that we talked about, or 765 line from the 2024 ITP. And then, again, I mean, this is the economic project that became a reliability project as soon as additional load contracts were signed with the local load serving entities. So ultimately, these are the 765 kV lines that were actually issued notices to construct. And again, you can see that here, right? This is, those other grayed out lines are not here now, right? So you don't see that middle connection. And so, and then everybody focused on the 765 kV stuff, but there's a lot of rebuilt facilities throughout the remaining portion of the footprint, and some new terminal equipments and substations. So it wasn't just purely a southern focused plan, but it was for 765 kV lines. It was.
Mhm.
This is another slide that they presented, that staff presented at the board to defend its position of only recommending 8.5 billion when half the people in the room wanted 11 or an $18 billion portfolio. And what they showed was, look, if you recall from a slide earlier, the whole portfolio had a 6 to 10 benefit cost ratio. Now we're talking about a 12 to 18 benefit cost ratio. And so I think it really did recognize that the plan was refined to truly deal with what we had to at this point in the process, the most beneficial projects relative to the investment. These are the risk mitigation measures that we've already sort of talked about a little bit in terms of, utilizing RR 710. I misspoke earlier. I called this business practice 760, but I think RR 710 bolsters business practice 760 and just says, look, we're not just going to start building this stuff right now, like day one. There's likely to be a competitive process. We're not likely to actually start moving dirt for 18 months probably, or 24 months, and then it takes 6 years to build these things. But so a lot of this is, we're going to issue these notices to construct right now. We're going to continue to evaluate this. The board required the staff to report quarterly on the progress of firm service agreements for the load that is anticipated. The board changed the February board meeting from a virtual meeting to an on-site, to an in-person meeting, to have more robust conversation about the issuances of these notices to construct. This is not going to go into a lot of detail here, but here's the thing. This is a real key. This is what I pointed out before, is that with 0 megawatts of spot loads, which are basically, in their mind and their models, these are loads that are not supported by signed service agreements. If there are no more load growth that occurs within SPP, we're looking at going from 56 gigawatts to 75, right? It's a 33% increase. And you can see these load forecasts are if you start to consider and account for spot load growth. So it is truly a unprecedented moment with regard to electricity planning and load growth planning in this country.
Yeah, Justin, I should probably add there, because I think we are all concerned about, is this speculative? Is it not? But, we are seeing a lot of indications that give us firmer confidence that the load growth is happening. They said it, staff reiterated over and over through this process. Look at in their planning process, they have a future one and they have a future two. The future one, I don't remember if it doesn't include any spot loads, but it's the much more conservative approach that's got more just organic load growth. And future two is that much more aggressive approach that includes all the spot loads of, things they think could come. But they were really clear that just in the time that they developed those two scenarios, they've seen quite a bit of what Justin just talked about. People actually signing up, signing interconnection agreements, customers raising their hand and saying we're going to be here, and contractually committing to that, to the point where staff. I don't know exactly how they characterized it, but they basically said we've got a very growing confidence in our future two numbers. In fact, they may even be kind of conservative at this point. And we are more sure every day that the future one numbers are wrong. They're too low. We are moving much closer to the aggressive scenario as being the more realistic scenario based on firm commitments that we're getting. And so that does, on one hand, it's it's a little concerning because it's going to drive more infrastructure, it's going to drive more growth, but it is also comforting to know that we are getting more certainty that it is actually happening. So just want to make sure that that does come through, because I know I speak often about uncertainty and my concerns with that, but there is data coming in that might actually shine some light on what is actually going to happen.
Yeah, this is what you're talking about. It's these early numbers that actually everybody has more confidence in, right? Because it takes 2 years to build a data center or whatever. So, yeah, and the other thing to remember is they actually do three. They do future one, future two, and a base reliability model. Base reliability this is just stuff that has firm service agreements. Like all we're doing is just trying to keep the lights on. Well, look, these are the two. This is future one right here. Okay, this color, 72 gigawatts after 8 years, 9 years. And this is future two, this gold color. What they said is, look, our 2026 ITP base reliability model, which is this purple line, this now invalidates entirely our future one. We can't use it anymore. NERC won't allow us to for reliability planning. We can't. So, and look, it's not just, this is happening every time we update it. The entire going from 2023 to 2024, that was a 10-year growth. That was a 10-year jump in load growth. The year two load growth for in the 2024 ITP was higher than the 10-year load growth in 2023. So there's all kinds of things you can point to that, hopefully give you more and more confidence that these are real. This is real. It really is showing up in the short run.
Yeah. Probably the most relevant there, right, Justin, is the fact that next year, what they expect to see in their 2026 ITP, their future one, which would be their conservative growth case, is higher than their aggressive growth case just last year, right?
Right. So one more. If you look at 2024 ITP, we were just talking about this 1 year ago. Their 10-year load projection was 64 gigawatts. That's now the base reliability starting point at 2027. I mean, it's just, example after example after example of. All right. This is just showing that, when we talked about the expedited resource adequacy study process, which was, basically this one-off special study to get additional generation online to keep the lights on, the load serving entities all submitted their individual load forecasts for 2030 to support that filing that went before FERC. With duty of candor requirements, and these are verifications of this is our load forecast. That's actually higher. It's 79 gigawatts in 2030. Look, that's higher than the 10-year forecast. So anyway. All right. And then this is a really important slide. This is the 2025 ITP. This is in their modeling. These things are not purely theoretical, right? You can You can recreate with 40 years of weather data. You can recreate and say, what will 2034 look like if we make no changes, but all the load that we think is coming is coming? This is the result, the reliability that we've all become accustomed to for the last 100 years is 1 day in 10 years of outage, or 0.1 day per year. What they're saying is, and you can see it's not just in the South, it's up here around this Kansas City metro area, it's in Kansas as well, it's up in North Dakota. Their models show 114 days of load loss in 2034 if we don't do something between now and then. This is that slide that I've duplicated, we've already talked about. Quickly, here's benefit cost ratios, and we're almost done. This is, we really need to talk about this. This is the worst case scenario, okay? We talk about big dollars, talk about big investment amounts. That's to serve 18 million people in 14 states. At the highest, based on their 10-year projection, this 10-year transmission portfolio of what came out of MOPSI and the board, $8.5 billion. The highest individual year would be a $2.99 per month impact on a residential customer's bill, right? I don't say that to minimize the fact that, $3 a month on some residential customer bills is a big deal. Maybe all of them, but it's not $30 a month. It's not $50 a month. It's $3 in 2034. And what they're showing is that, and they do this with only adjusted production costs. Okay. So this is the most certain, most conservative estimate of what the benefit is that you get if you build transmission. I mean, you could get 100 different independent transmission modeling, planning people in the room and ask them how much certainty they have of the adjusted production cost estimates of SPPs modeling. And it might be, well, I think it's $5.60 or I think it's $2.80, but there is benefit there. Basically, this is just saying that when you have the ability to move power around a region, whether it's thermal or renewable or otherwise, there are fuel cost savings associated with that. There are scarcity cost, market cost savings associated with that. If you can identify with certainty what the future is going to look like with regard to the resource mix and how much natural gas is going to be and how much coal is going to be and how much load growth there's going to be, you can calculate precisely what the wholesale market impacts are going to be associated with building or not building transmission. And that's what these calculations show. And so what they're showing is in future one, Kansas will have a net benefit of $2.32 because of the fuel cost savings associated with building transmission. Now, what a lot of stakeholders point out is really a concern is the disparate differences associated with some of these benefit cost ratios. This isn't showing, by the way, that New Mexico customers are all going to get free electricity. This is showing that if you don't do anything in that region, your power bill is going to go up by $80 a month.
Wow.
That's just the idea, is just that there's so much load growth in that area. The markets are going to be so stressed. You're going to be using the most expensive generation online at all times. And so that's important to keep in mind that these are what would have been. This is absent building the infrastructure. This is what the costs would have increased. And now we get these benefits. So the reason there's a difference between future one and future two is because, two difference. One, future two has more load growth. So you see that it actually costs less on a per customer basis the more your load grows, right? And so they've added that into the calculations, but also the more load growth you put on the system, the more stress you put on the system, the more fuel and purchase power costs you might have to pay if you don't have the right infrastructure in place. And so that's why you see more, larger benefits for future. And also that load growth is distributed. The future too, load growth is more distributed throughout the footprint, which is why you see a little more balanced benefit cost on an individual customer basis. This is the, I was talking about before, adjusted production cost savings. That's this column. Well, there's other benefits and costs to transmission as well. And so when you look at the entirety of the benefit, the benefit and cost calculations, and you get the full BC ratios, both future 1 and future 2, and those are right here. So, when we first started talking about this, you'll recall Kansas had some -19 benefit cost ratios that were really causing us to get worried. Ultimately, as this portfolio was refined and slimmed down, it definitely got more palatable and more equitable across the region. There still are questions, of course, of whether or not is it appropriate or equitable for one state to get a benefit cost ratio that's 10 times what another one is, Probably not. And that's why everybody wants to have the conversation about cost allocation in 2026. And then this is my last slide. There were many, many other slides that were presented in terms of sensitivities, right? Because people wanted to know, well, what happens if we never get production tax credits back in this country, and this is a permanent energy policy change? Do we need the transmission still? What happens if we, don't retire another coal plant for the next 5 or 10 years? Do we need the transmission still? They did extensive scenario planning and analysis that they presented, but this one was, what you come away with is that we're building this transmission because of the load that's forecasted. And so what they did 2 sensitivities and said, the first one is this blue line. What if our year 2 load doesn't actually show up until year 5? And our year 5 load doesn't actually show up until year 10. And then the second one was the purple line, which is, what if our load only grows at 1% per year and all of this spot load doesn't show up? What's the benefit cost ratio for the region if that happens? And what the results showed is actually we still need the transmission, right? In terms of the region as a whole, it doesn't pay for itself as quickly. It doesn't pay for itself as significantly, but it still is beneficial electrical infrastructure for the region, the central part of the United States. So I didn't, it's an interesting sensitivity, and it's kind of comforting to hear it. But on the other hand, we've been expressing some skepticism about whether or not this load was going to show up for 2 or 3 years. And every time there's another forecast that gets made by the load serving entities early on in the forecast, it's actually more load than the most aggressive scenario from 2 years ago, 10 years out. So ultimately, I do think this infrastructure is going to be used. But this is the kind of analytics and the kind of modeling evaluation that's so critical to make sure we're not overbuilding or building the wrong type of stuff in the region that our customers are going to pay for. So, and I guess I have one more slide or a couple more. This is what's coming. This is the future. This shows all of the lines that were planned and evaluated in both 2024, 2025, and what they anticipate may be coming in 26. I don't think there isn't exceptional certainty associated with this, but this is the overlay study that they are going to complete in 2026 that a lot of the stakeholders in the region demanded, which is we're not just going to start this build out in the South and help them get a leg up in terms of economic development and load growth. We're going to evaluate this. We need to understand across the entire region, what are the costs? What are the benefits? It's a generational type of an investment. It needs to be done right. And this is that's the last slide this is the actual words of the motions, the action items that came out of the board meeting, which I know we kind of talked about a little bit, but it's, they want quarterly updates on how are these load projections playing out? How are they materializing? Are they materializing? Are there firm service agreements that are backing up the notices to construct for the transmission that we just issued? And I think what everybody on the call and everybody listening in should take some comfort in is that these transmission lines, you don't build them overnight. The Wolf Creek to Blackberry line that just got energized last year came out of the 2019 ITP, right? And that was just a 100-mile, 345 kV line. So it takes time. Real money is not going to be spent on this construction. It's not going to be recovered from customers until it's in service. And as we're moving down this path, I think what the board is indicating with these risk mitigation metrics is at any time we will cancel these notices to construct if we determine that we actually don't need the infrastructure. Right? These portfolios aren't going to worsen an affordability issue in Kansas in 2026. That's not going to happen. It's not 27. They may start to be constructed in 2027 or 2028. And it takes a long time to build transmission. And when they go into service is when customers will start to pay for them and also reap the benefits associated with them.
Yeah, and Justin, because you mentioned affordability, I mean, I want to reiterate for the other commissioners and for anybody listening in. So first of all, just, the way the governance is at SPP, we don't have a vote on this, but that doesn't mean, we haven't tried to influence the process and that we don't speak up. But I want to be really clear that the reason we would support this moving forward is that we believe it would mitigate an affordability issue in the future, that it would be beneficial to customers as compared to an option of not making the investments. So, I mean, I want that to be really clear that, there are costs of investing in infrastructure, but, kind of the flip side of that is everything Justin just laid out is there are real costs of not investing in infrastructure that's needed. And that's what we want to get a better handle on over the next year. And if we're going to stick our heads up and support this a year from now, it's going to be because we think that it mitigates an affordability issue or it improves an affordability issue as to the reverse. So just want to be really clear on that.
That's it. Thanks everybody for sticking in. We can, like I said, my next meeting isn't until 1 o'clock, so I'm at your disposal. I think we've had some really good, robust discussion, but I'm certainly willing to continue it. And thanks for everybody's patience. I mean, this is obviously an important issue. I knew we'd have a robust discussion. I didn't quite think it'd go almost 2 hours long, but willing to continue if we need to.
Well, Justin, thank you so much for the level of detail you've provided, integrating all these different issues and giving us a very holistic yet down-to-earth approach to these issues. I would have just one prefatory comment to the observation that I think that Chair French just made, which I think is valid. I'll kind of provide sort of a bit of the flip side of that. Basically, what we're talking about here in terms of my understanding, basically is opportunity costing. What's the opportunity cost of not building these things? I think that's the essence of what we're suggesting here. The problem with that is that, as with any forecasting tool, opportunity cost analysis involves a reliance upon the underlying assumptions and the validity of the underlying assumptions, and whether in the process of taking into consideration the costs associated with the foregone alternative, we may have more than one foregone alternative, which the whole thing is just such an enormous Rubik's Cube. And I appreciate the efforts, Chair French, that you and Justin make in advancing these issues before SPP. But I'm concerned. I think I think we're taking a deliberative approach. There's no doubt about it. Nobody wants to spend a nickel more for any undertaking that is absolutely necessary. So, as I say, we're going to have an interesting 26, it appears.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree. It is my viewpoint that it seems like there are an awful lot of stakeholders that can come up with things to build that are cost beneficial. But my view is that customers have a finite amount of dollars.
Mhm.
And so we need to find the most cost beneficial investments. That's probably going to be a mix of some generation. We're already embarking on that. It's probably going to be some transmission. But let's really winnow down what are the most beneficial investments, because we can't just invest in everything that's got a benefit.
Right.
So I totally agree.
I'd just like to add my 2 cents, and that I'm appreciative of both you, Chair French, and Justin, that you're at the table with that approach that you're taking, and looking out for the customer and the concerns that goes along with it. Just fascinating talk this morning. It's been very, very educational. So thank you very much for both of you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
We're going to
We
be doing a
will-
lot more of this with the legislature, I have a feeling.
I have a feeling we're gonna go
Yeah.
speak to our friends
Yeah.
and keep them updated the next few months, and
Absolutely.
absolutely welcome that opportunity.
Yeah.
That's part of our job. So, all right. Well, thank you, Justin. We appreciate it. I appreciate you clearing your calendar once a quarter to to keep us updated. So, with that, we'll conclude Justin's item, and if we have come to the conclusion of all the items noticed on today's business meeting agenda, and if there is nothing further to come before us, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move that we adjourn.
Do I have a second? Commissioner Keen's on mute. So,
I'll try to do it without hand signs. Yes, second. Thank you. Sorry.
all right, we got a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor, please vote aye.
Aye.
Bye.
Aye. We're adjourned. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.